Thank you. Thank you very much for sticking around. This has been stewing with me for years and years and years, primarily because my dear friend Roy served in the army. He was a teacher of history and an inspector of schools. He's nurtured me with passion for history and getting me to think about what's not said in stories. When he was a teacher, he got into a lot of trouble because he put to his students, Earl Hay, I want you to discuss whether he was a war criminal, for and against. And I want you to think about the arguments, look to the historical sources, and make up your own minds. He almost lost his job for this. Because it's not spoken about. So I'm going to be reviewing some of the history that Alan Clark brings up in his book, The Donkeys. I brought my copy here, and you can see that there's notes put throughout it, and you're welcome to have a look. There's so much in there. I have had to work out what I'm leaving out. Now, I've chosen to leave out the grimmest details and the grim details. And I want to speak of the story of how the High Command failed so many people and sent them to their certain death. I think it's only right that these stories get remembered alongside the heroic stories that we get reminded of. So, this is a story of the destruction of an army. The old professional army of the United Kingdom that always won the last battle, whose regiments had fought at Quebec, Corunna, and in the Indies, were trained in musketry at hand, drilled in the parched earth of Chudapur, were machine gunned, gassed, and finally buried in 1915. I was drawn to this subject almost by chance, and these are Alan Clark's words. While working in another field, I came across the diary of an officer in the line space and was overcome by the horror of the contents and the sense of resignation and duty that characterized the writing. In the first 2 hours of the Battle of Lewes, more British soldiers died than the total number of casualties in all three services on both sides on D-Day 1944. Horrific. And slowly, as the field of operations widened, their fate became apparent. Again and again, they were called upon to attempt the impossible, and in the end, they were all killed. It was as simple as that. So I'm picking out what I think are themes. The first one I'll start with is self-aggrandizement. It may be suggested that in the preceding half-century to the First World War, the British commanders had acquired reputations that were greatly out of proportion to their achievements, nor had it been inconvenient for the politicians to allow these inflated reputations to flourish. For the generals were far away, they could make no trouble, and their prowess, as it seemed, reflected glory on the home government. Thus, a popular tradition of heroic infallibility had been established which was to mate disastrously with the amateurish good humour and ignorance of contemporary military theory that was reality. For the adulation that had been their lot from the press and public had deluded the commanders with the notions of their ability and made them at the same time secure against dismissal by the politicians. And that is a theme for all ages, when people are totally impervious to the mistakes that they make and the willful ignorance, even worse. People must be allowed to make mistakes, but when it's willful ignorance, somebody decides to ignore vital information and push people into situations that bring harm back upon them. This makes me furious. So I want to talk about French and Hague. The British High Command had been constituted in part by Sir John French and Douglas Haig, who had established a friendship and training. French had been given command of the army. As the Times reported at the time, there was no painful canvassing of candidates, no acrimonious discussion, no odious comparison of the merits of respective generals. Absolute bloody madness. Rumour had it that French had a liking for the ladies, and rumour has it that his taste was not unconnected to his urgent need for £2,000 in training when he was commander of the cavalry brigade at Aldershot. He had borrowed the money from Douglas Haig. At that time, his brigade major, and now one of his corps commanders. Apparently, he was not really a Haig of Bermerside, although he took on the title of this nobleman, but came from the whiskey-making side of the family. Hence, he had not entered the Grey Scots, the Scots Greys, which had been considered a natural choice, but joined the 7th Hussars. He failed the Staff College examinations. However, the Duke of Cambridge, who at the time had the right of nominating candidates, was the acquaintance of Haig's elder sister, Henrietta. After these auspices, Haig applied a second time, and the formality of an entrance exam was waived. From there, he took frequent leave to attend shooting parties organised by his sister for the Prince of Wales. And these entries are boldly inscribed in the Leave Book, and they made their impression on Haig's instructors. We're going to talk next about the conditions brought about by poor management and the catastrophic strategic choices that were made. The choices for taking positions were blighted by poor decisions on behalf of the High Command, often choosing waterlogged low points of the terrain in which to dig in. The troops were under-resourced and poorly organised despite their training. Picks and shovels were considered plentiful when there were as few as 2 or 3 per platoon. And efforts to commandeer them from local civilians met with little success, as the Flemish used to bury them rather than give up the tools of their livelihood. And it's also important to put in context the First World War in terms of civilian populations and collateral damage didn't have nearly the devastating effect that the Second World War was to have on civilian populations. It was very much a professional war, fought by professional armies. There was also a serious shortage of sandbags and watering for revetting the sides of the trenches. From the 25th of October until the 10th of March, there were only 18 dry days. And on 11 of these, the temperature was below freezing. The trenches themselves had become little less than culverts, replacing in rudimentary fashion the drainage system of the countryside. It was impossible to dig deeper than 18 inches without finding water. And along whole stretches of the line, garrisons had to do their stint with the water waist high, for the fire step had crumbled away, and there was not the materials to construct an adequate breastwork after the German fashion. On Christmas Day 1914, there had been no firing, and in many sectors the troops had climbed out of their trenches, meeting in no man's land, had talked and exchanged gifts, but such a development met with strong disapproval at GHQ, and the officers responsible were punished. It did not happen again. I'll be talking about the new punishments that had been introduced by French May in this period, which were much more brutal than previous. GHQ seems to have been slow in realising that the unfortunate tactical sighting of the line was making an important contribution to the, quote, wastage of lives from illnesses and conditions. Finally, when it was seen the line must be altered, there never seems to have been any thought of achieving this by making local withdrawals and inviting men to step forward into the background. Instead, a variety of small but extravagant attacks were authorized with the intention of straightening the line and eliminating some of the more tiresome German enfilade buttresses that dominated it. So it strikes me that it was very much these people sitting in a tent, eating pheasants, going, I'd like a straight line, not checking with the people in the front line, forced to deal with these conditions. So I jump now to the ignorance of frontline reports. There are various accounts of frontline reports being ignored by high command to inform which skirmishes were to be undertaken tactically. I think an example is where on March the 11th, 1915, troops had, quote, suffered heavily in crossing the open ground that led up to the foremost positions. The command structure had met with a flat refusal on the part of the officer in command to go into the attack a second time. And this is from communications there. I received a note from the Worcestershire. We've got to advance. Will you give the order? I answered, no, it is a mere waste of life. Impossible to get 20 yards, much less 200. The trenches have not been touched by the artillery. If artillery cannot touch them, the only way to advance is from the right flank. A frontal attack will not get near them. In spite of this, the two leading companies of the Worcester were ordered over the top by their own commander. Here they were shot down almost at once. The fate of Colonel Pritchard, after his courageous refusal to subject his men to pointless slaughter, is not recorded. But if we go to another source, a book, for the sake of example, capital court martials 1914 to 18, The Truth. This was written by a former circuit judge, Anthony Babington. His book examines the introduction of the death penalty as punishment for court-martial by the British High Command in this period. Previously, flogging had been the way, the punishment dished out court-martial. This book gives an account of the people who were shot by the British side, our own folk, shell-shocked, some put into impossible positions, given no recourse, but then having their lives taken away in horrible ways. They were made to be shot by their own comrades, their own people. And it was a cruel and unusual punishment. So I'm going back to the willful ignorance of intelligence reports. It must be recorded that both French and British, the French army that is, and British army, had ample warning of the Germans' intention to use gas. On the 20th of March, some prisoners had been captured on the south side of the alley and under interrogation had given extensive details of the plan and the placing of the cylinders in the trenches. The idea was regarded as being so fantastic, though, that it took some time to filter up the chain of command. And in the meantime, the division was posted to a new area. When finally it reached army headquarters, it was duly published in the bulletin. But this was only circulated in the Artois district, over 100 miles away. Then, a week before the attack, a deserter surrendered in the exact area that was to be attacked, near Langemarck, and supported this evidence by showing one of the crude respirators that the German infantry had already been issued. The French divisional commander was gravely impressed, but the corps commander, Balfourier, dismissed the concept as absurd and administered a sharp rebuke at the manner in which the usual channels had been bypassed to warn the British and French on either side. Then, 3 days later, the Belgians captured further evidence of the enemy design, and again the information was not taken seriously above brigade level. All these warnings might just as well have never been given for the heed that was paid them. The higher the rank, the more ludicrous did the idea seem. The British commanders taking their line from Haig, who a fortnight previously had given a short shrift to a visitor whose mind was working on these lines. I quote, "Lord Dundonald arrived from England. He is studying the conditions of war in the hopes of being able to apply to modern conditions an invention of a great-grandfather for driving a garrison out of a fort by using sulphur fumes." I asked him how he arranged for a favourable wind. So, I'm going to move to the Battle of Loos, the second day. This is the second time we've seen impossible feats. Both Haig and Hayton were given ample warning that an unprepared attack by two untrained divisions was unlikely to succeed. The question of revising the order in light of the intelligence reports does not seem to have been considered. And so the stage was set for a repetition. For the set-piece attack of 11 Corps, that was to be launched in the broad light of an hour before noon on the 26th. It was a futile, foredoomed operation, as like that of the Light Brigade. Not since the Germans attacked in the closing days of the First Battle of Ypres had such dense masses of infantry deployed for a daylight assault. For fully 10 minutes, the Germans held their fire as two divisions deployed in column of extended line and started obediently off with their progress down the gentle slope towards the Lens Road. It was a tense moment for the enemy, watching in silence until, at a range of 1,000 yards, the order to fire was given. At this point, I'm going to switch to accounts of this from the German side, from the German perspective, just to get some sense of I struggle for words, what to call it. The diary of the 15th Reserve Regiment records that 10 columns of extended line could clearly be distinguished, each one estimated at more than 1,000 men, and offering such a target as had never been seen before, or even thought possible. Never had the machine gunners such straightforward work to do, nor done it so effectively. They traversed to and fro along the enemy ranks unceasingly. The men stood on the fire steps, some even on the parapets, and fired triumphantly into the mass of men advancing across the open grassland. As the entire field of fire was covered with the enemy's infantry, the effect was devastating, and they could be seen falling literally in their hundreds. The German diary noted with amazement, in spite of it, the intensity of the fire. The extended columns continued their advance in good order and without interruption. When they reached the Lens Road, one of their companies advanced from the Hullich trench in an attempt to divert the attack, but only a small party of the enemy swung round to meet it. The mass took no notice and went on regardless, past the southern front of the village. Here they came under the enfilade fire both of troops lining the position and of a battery of artillery concealed within the village. Their losses mounted up rapidly, and under this terrific punishment, the lines began to get more and more confused. Nevertheless, they went on doggedly, right up to the wire entanglement. The diary of the German 153rd Regiment tells the same sort of story as that of the 15th. Dense masses of the enemy, line after line, appeared over the ridge. Some of their officers even mounted on horseback and advancing as if carrying out a field day drill in peacetime. Our artillery and machine guns riddled their ranks as they came on. As they crossed the northern front of the Boy Hugo, the machine guns were caught them in the flank, and whole battalions were annihilated. The English made 5 consecutive efforts to press on past the wood and reach the second line position, but finally, weakened by their terrible losses, they had to give in. One of the German battalion commanders spoke later of the revolting and nauseating impression made on them all as they watched the slaughter. So much so that after the retreat had begun, they ceased fire. Before them was the lichened field, the field of corpses on loose. And as among them dozens of khaki-clad forms rose once again and began to limp and call back their own lives, no shot was fired at them from the German trenches for the rest of the day. So great was the feeling of compassion and mercy for the enemy over such a victory. There had been 12 battalions making the attack, the strength of just under 10,000 men. And in 3.5 hours of the actual battle, their casualties were 385 officers and 7,861 men. The Germans suffered no casualties. So this is an account in memoriam of how life was squandered through mismanagement and willful ignorance. If Roy was still here today and I were in his class, I would be saying, I think, yes, Haig should have been brought up on charges. It is out of respect for those that have lost their lives that I want to acknowledge the circumstances which led to this. The horror of war is distant, and to those who have lived in peacetime, whilst there is peace, it is our responsibility to ensure its future, in part by being respectfully critical in our voices and acting on our consciences. Included in this responsibility is to speak truth to power and rationally question idiot leaders. In our peacetime, ours is to question why, and ours is not to do or die, unlike so many poor souls. And the book, For the Sake of Example, gives a clearer picture of how people retreating from banks of gas were told to walk into it, from tactical idiocies, beyond idiocies, pushed into gruesomeness that I've left out here today. But I think worst is that when people most needed to be lifted from battle, they were shot, they were court-martialed. And All Quiet on the Western Front is an important book to take alongside. And there's a bit in that where the German soldiers are sent back on leave, and the guy is walking, and people are slapping him on the back, and let me buy you a stein of beer. And the guy has been hauled down, has been gutted by senseless murder. It didn't make sense to anybody. So, with that, I respectfully, I'll stop there. But I will invite anybody who has any thoughts on remembering what needs to be remembered of First World War. Share. My grandfather was killed in the First World War. It's 500,000 men
goes back 500,000. And I went to the battlefield last year, well, earlier this year, and couldn't find my grandfather's grave disturbed. But I persevered a bit with one cemetery to another, and then a guy directed me to the museum, which was outside here. My taxi, and the guy who's the chair of the veterans looked at everything up for me and showed me where to go get that. And the struggle that I had to find that was draining for me. And while I was there, I thought, imagine carrying backpacks and everything else that they carry and try and fight at these battles. And it just blew me away thinking. And that's where I realised the asses that led the brave people. I'm not saying that some of them obviously weren't the brave. What I'm saying is the incompetence and the power-hungry politicians as well who create conditions for these things. We should thank Shane and itself.
And that, looking to the sources of the decisions that are made in the name of, I'm constantly reminded by a much earlier ragged talk by David Turner talking about the arms trade and how it's a significant. Well, Britain's one of the leaders in the arms trade. Where are these decisions for? I cannot reconcile myself to these understandings. Particularly, I'm slightly traumatized growing up as a boy, because from that height you're running around with sticks, Tommy guns, and heroic ideas, and it was only when I was a teenager that I came into proximity with people who fought in the wars, and suddenly it was like being plunged into icy water. And from that moment, I got rid of these stupid and idiotic pretensions of a little boy wanting to be a warrior, and understood that my job's much, but it's a much more important thing not to go into battle and never to have money invested in arms or, I don't know. I agree. I agree that I agree with the sentiments that Simon's talking about. I think it's odd, very odd, that pacifism has become maligned, sidestepped. I think it's very odd that so much of our entertainment is stacked with the latest guns that are manufactured. They're almost like gun catalogues. You watch the latest Terminator film and, this is the latest, bigger. Yeah. I veer much more towards the bonobo or the gorilla. I think I'd get on with them better. So
I wanted to just mention, I think, I wonder, to us, Remembrance Sunday or Remembrance, it seems to me an important thing to consider people who sacrificed their lives. And also, when I hear you speak and hear these stories, it's like it's like a nice package. It's a nice package, remember, it's nice copy, it's nice presentation, but, there's also ignorance, the self-aggrandizement, the incompetence that led to many of those deaths, and also, became aware of the research through the royal the royals at war, and the war was actually a fact that came about because of it was the royal family, from Queen Victoria, her family, her grandsons were, or sons were, one was German, one was British, and there was a lot of that going on. And so when you have this nice package, remember Sunday, it's just now all nice and clean, but in actual fact, there was so much incompetence and all the things that were influenced this massacre just get cast aside and just seem nice for remembrance. So, what's your opinion on the remembrance, how we remember that war and how it's presented?
I think very much so. I think we've got a problem, or there's a certain mindset that we find in key positions, which is never apologize, never explain, never take on any criticism, just rules, strong, stiff upper lip. We'll just charge through whatever it takes, at all costs, and it does cost everything. And we find this again and again when too much power is concentrated in too few who are unquestionable. The country's been made bankrupt by people, the same kind of donkeys, the same kind of idiots who fail and fail everybody, and then get given lots of money and a new job. And it's so important to give respect to the people who set out to keep people safe. But in a civilized society, I think we face the past, and we honour the past by being true and complete. And that, I think, will make stronger people, better people, healthier civilizations, making everything ever so sweet. Doesn't do anybody justice, is my feeling. Does that?
Those who do not understand, we are condemned to repeat it. And I mean, the conditions are much worse now. The forces that are prepared to commit this genocide for profit and their own power they have concentrated more money in their hands than ever before. And, as we sit here, our taxpayer money has gone on, arms to Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia have blockaded the poorest Arab country, Yemen, and the genocide going on there, cholera and famine and all the rest. And I don't hear the Labour Party making much of a fuss about that. I don't hear anyone saying anything about that, And then when you put next to that, the Labour Party won't even say no to this. They're currently saying, well, the UK Party is saying, yes, they'll back a replacement tribunal. This 200 billion, whatever, it's much more, which is an American-based weapon, which would be under their control. And that while we're being bamboozled with all this talk of Brexit or not Brexit or what's going on, we could be very poor for much longer and so on, or even worse. Meanwhile, there's this European army being formed, which is being, basically, it's under a thing called PESCO. They're driving to a united European defense force because they're needed against the pesky Russians. And there's going to be a very large Polish and other East European land force component to this. And Britain has been, in the person of Boris Johnson, so has been attending all the meetings for this. They haven't actually signed up yet. Other countries have debated it and ended up signing up. This hasn't even been mentioned, as far as I know, in Parliament. It's hardly surfaced in the papers, apart from, the odd article in the Daily Express or the Daily Mail from some sort of little Englanders who got wind of it. But, it's, what happens then? Because this new European Defence Force, which it seems we're likely to be part of, is going to be directed against Russia. That's already very clear, and that's the noise that Theresa May has been making. Yeah, what do we do? It's, plus put next to that the fact that the next wars, as they keep predicting, massively cyber, massively drones, and now they want machines AI to be able to take its own kill decisions. That's the next thing that's on the cards. There's not even someone pressing a button anymore. There's, machines lined up on the board, and when they spot the target, let rip. Anyway, yeah.
From what I can, I think. Did anybody catch that? Basically, Allied planes struck Médecins Sans Frontières hospital. And then there was all this backpedaling, all the usual sort of press quagmire. And it made me think about what's happening to invest countries into it. So, pension funds. People's pension funds are being invested in arms and in technology, anything that gets another grubby buck. And that I see as the equivalent, the financial equivalent of putting civilians into a military target, because it's no longer very clear who's, do I do with, what do I, my pension's really important. Our well-being's important. But then how do I go to the government? How have you invested this? How do the universities go? How have you invested our pensions? So I think one of possibly the clearest routes that we can take is find out how our financial instruments, ISAs, PEPs, pensions, are invested.
Should be invested in.
Yeah.
That's why I'm committed my pension and I get invested.
By being
At least one part. So you go. So
by being journalistic, being informed, I think that's a really important thing, because we get the sweet spots, but anything that's slightly I don't know, deemed as controversial. You can hardly get an article through the mainstream press that it's good to support people who are in prisons. Because people rattling cages louder go, prisoners don't deserve anything, they've abdicated their human rights, blah, 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 blah. Wait a minute, you're disembodying their human rights. I mean, to me, it's a very simple thing. There's a lot of people in prison for crimes of poverty. Not violent, malevolent crimes. And I'm not suggesting, not talking about these people, but I just think the mainstream press is so narrowed that we need to be informed and informative. Cheers.
Last murder. The cheap ones who just stolen something is 37,750 per annum. I've just noticed that they wanted a swimming pool and study. Our prison here in Edinburgh has put into building standards. They want a swimming pool. We've already got people which they want a swimming pool.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I can't help but think all that money, thousands for mass murders, then all the victims around there in wheelchairs. Who's doing anything for that? How come you know, 100,000 to keep somebody that's put them in a wheelchair and kill somebody else?
I hear big categoricals.
Sorry,
I don't know. They put in for it. They put interest in it.
is that for the next? I'm just wondering, is that for the ones, how come it costs so much money?
Because they are architects, psychologists, you name it, they have got so, and they don't eat test, they eat organic. Check it
Well,
out.
that's very interesting.
Go ahead and see it. Good. I've got a friend that's voluntary.
Well, it's not for the ones you said, it's not for the
We have
national
the best prison in the whole world. Norway,
really?
US, not good one. That's it.
For a
Oh,
few months, many years ago. Certainly nothing to recommend it.
so what about swimming?
I don't know.
Well, if you want to hear the former Chief Inspector of Her Majesty's Prisons in Scotland talk about this, you can on Ragged Uni website, and he says prisons are awful places, dull, and anyway. There's a panel of people, including Professor McCara at Edinburgh Law School, we've got Pete White, who's Positive Prisons, Positive Futures, and former inspector of prisons, talking about prisons. And his thoughts are very much like yours. There's nothing to recommend. These are awful, dehumanizing spaces. And to think about people categorically, like your language fell into there. People,
That is the best country in the world to be in prison.
That's not what
Well, that's what I was.
Where?
Where's the best place to live?
Well, they say that prisons are quite good in Norway.
No, this week's Norway, let me tell you.
I don't know if you get that information.
Well, I think it's on the Did you check it out?
No, I saw a
Well,
program,
you know, it's like
but I did have reason to talk to people who work with Scottish prisons and with cutting of staff and so on. Most people in the prisons are actually spending a huge amount of time in their cells because there isn't enough prison officers to escort them to classes, and there aren't classes anyway, etc., etc. It's much more like
Well,
the
you put
others.
it's there. There's a shower, you've got food, you've got one bed. You've also got mobile phones, computers.
They're not allowed mobile phones.
Oh, I was told to get mobile phones.
Certainly not.
Is it not the case though?
This is the
If anyone's got mobile phones, they're ready for drugs to be smuggled. So mobile
not?
phones are banned from roads.
Yeah.
Is it not the case though? So I'm trying to tie this in with the perspective
Yeah.
of the First World War. We're encouraged to direct attention at the bottom of society.
Yeah.
It's at the top of society where
Yeah.
we need to start turning our attention. So
Exactly.
the poor people that are incarcerated,
I mean, if they've got their basic human rights taken away from them, they might have a flashy swimming pool or whatever, but they're not free. Not that I'm suggesting we're free, because we're in a stratified state of enslavement, except we don't necessarily appreciate that. But I think really, and it's when it's a poor comparison, perhaps, for instance, when we direct our attention to the immigrants, the asylum seekers, always at the bottom of society, we're encouraged by the ruling elites to turn our attention at the bottom. And the media is the channel that encourages this, because it whips up all of this, that, the prisoners get this, and the asylum seekers get that, and blah, blah, blah,
What
blah.
do the victims get?
Well,
It's just about the rules.
exactly so, but ultimately we're all victims to some extent or other.
I'm talking about people that are in wheelchairs, have walked the talk. What do they get?
Well, they need our attention, absolutely, more than anybody.
Their friends being murdered, they're in a wheelchair.
To try and change the entire paradigm, I think we need to ultimately turn our attention to the top. And you go back to what the gentleman in front was saying here about the ruling elites and Queen Victoria. Like, Queen Victoria's favourite grandson was the Kaiser. So what on earth's going on here? We've been hoodwinked to such a grand extent.
Hollywood Barrett, an American company, couldn't sell their nuts. They're American nuts because of the GMCs. Russia has bought it, and now get Russian nuts in Hollywood. They couldn't go around here.
With that, can I thank you very much for listening.
Could I say one last thing? Sorry to stick my neck out one last time, but just to leave us on a positive note.
Yes.
Yes, we're dealing with such heavy subject matter. I mean, we're dealing with the heaviest of all subject matter. And if I had a bit more, we'd had a bit more time. I'd like to have shown this section. For those that are taking a DVD away with us, you're in for a treat, because there's a moment in the film that shines a light on the example of Costa Rica. And a bit like Harry Patch, when most people have never heard of this man, yet as a British subject with such significance, everybody in this country should know about it. In the same way, everybody on planet Earth should know about Costa Rica. Their example to the world is absolutely extraordinary. And when I came upon Harry Patch and that light bulb moment, I had it all the more intensified when I hit upon Costa Rica. Costa Rica, the first country on planet Earth that's demilitarized. And it didn't do this last week or last year. Did it in 1959, following the Second World War. Costa Rica was taken over by a dictator who turned into a benign dictator, and one of the things he did was abolish the military. And given that Costa Rica is in a very volatile part of the world, it's not like New Zealand where it's minding its own business and doesn't have to be terribly concerned about anything. It's right in the thick of it. And yet they have adopted a defiant position, the national position of pacifism. And in terms of leaving this on a good note, for those that aren't aware of an organisation called New Economics Foundation, and I think that's very important to stress, because at the end of the day, economics and money, it's all a construct. As Adam Smith said, all money is a matter of belief. So our entire paradigm is controlled by a construct. If you go online and you look at the New Economics Foundation, and they're a think tank based down in England, and they look at the world from a different perspective altogether, and they don't assess countries by their GDP. They look at different indices in order to gauge the well-being of countries. So they look at things like, obviously, all the social horrors like suicide and alcoholism, drug abuse. They look at all of that. They look at environmental sustainability, how these countries are truly making an effort to live in a state of harmony with Mother Earth. And there are other aspects of their analysis. And the country that's number one in the hit parade on planet Earth, according to the New Economics Foundation, they have a thing called the Happy Planet Index. What is number one? It's Costa Rica. And the Costa Rican people, since they demilitarized, have been going up and up in the world. terms of their level of well-being. And the tangible example of this now is people of Costa Rica, their life expectancy is higher than the life expectancy of the people of America, United States of America. So for anybody that dismisses Costa Rica as some no better country that's developing, second world, third world, or whatever, there's the truth of the evidence. And that's tangibly connected to the very fact that they're not spending a penny on armaments. And the money is going into their school system, their hospital systems, their library systems, all of that. Programs of social uplift is what we call it. So you can find out a bit more about that if you end up taking a deal with. That's not a sales pitch, even if it sounds crudely so.
It's so right, leaving it on a positive note. And I'm reminded of my friend Grant Crossy, who wrote about an essay called "Is Samuel Hunting for the Muppet?" He's a political theorist who was going, "Oh well, we just fight as apes. We fight more." Well, Grant studied politics and analysed his work, and he said, "Well, he's lying through his teeth. The world is actually getting more peaceful the more we communicate over." Well, he didn't say the more we communicate, but over time, it does seem that. So yes. Vive Costa Rica. So,
If we become neutral, is that the only way to get rid of the arms? Because we make so much arms, most of our companies are making up.
I don't know, but that's a great question to leave me with. I will study it and I'll get back to you on it.